Hi everyone, my name is Stan Nurilov and I have the internet weather for this week. So we start as usual with the top 10 most probe ports. We're really looking for exploitation or scanning activity on the internet and trying to understand how much of it is it, which ports does it impact, and what are the top ports that are being sought after by anyone really. So the top 10 ports here, if you've been following the show and if you watch the internet weather, they're pretty much the same all the time. But port 389 UDP recently, I think mid-December, reappeared, and I hadn't looked at it for a while, so I just wanted to check that out a little bit more in depth today. Here is another chart. This is the top 10 most sources probing. So this is again a look at scanning activity against internet protocol ports that we monitor. And again, this is organized by the number of devices looking concurrently for these ports and scanning for these ports. Again, port 389 UDP is here, and it's one that we haven't looked at for a while, and I just wanted to see what the activity looks like and share that with everyone. So diving in, here is the activity for the past 90 days for 389 UDP. A lot of our viewers might know that 389 UDP is associated with LDAP. As you could see, scanning activity on this port has, kind of comes and goes and has been pretty consistently there. But there was a major difference sometime mid-December, I would say. And just zooming out and looking at it over the year, or for the past 365 days, we could see that the activity, again, it comes and goes, but really mid-December is when there was like a really big change. So what does the change have to do with? As it turns out, as we saw, it's the number of IP addresses doing the scanning concurrently and all together. Usually, this is a sign of a botnet or some new threat or vulnerability targeting this for this many devices to be doing scanning together. In fact, if you look at the latest numbers, it's something like on the order of 17,000 IP addresses doing the scanning every hour, which is quite high. The only weird part, I would say, is if you're kind of paying attention to botnets and how they grow, they don't normally follow such a straight pattern. Usually, as a worm spreads or a botnet grows, you see more of a gradual increase or a gradual decrease. But this kind of very flat scanning is highly irregular, I would say, for a naturally spreading worm. So I decided to take a look at the IP addresses that are engaged in this just to understand the activity a little bit better. And I noticed that they are distributed in about 94 data centers all over the world. And that there's scanning, basically some kind of discovery scanning, it appears. The ranges of these hosting clusters and IP addresses seem to relate with security researchers that are engaged in some kind of discovery scanning. There's a lot obviously emanating out of Asia, but then some as well out of the US. And the reason why there's 16,000 IP addresses is because there's basically 90 ranges where the entire subnet is basically engaged in scanning. So if you do the math, 90 times 256, you'll get lots of IP addresses. And it seems as the different clusters are turned up for the discovery scanning, that kind of is the reason why the graph looks like this. It's very measured, constant scanning, and again, probably more related to being some sort of a security research project or something like that. One thing that's pretty notable, that's important to take into account here as well, is log4j exploitation. Log4j came out around this time frame. I think most people became familiar with it like around December 10th. So it's just, this chart starts just before that. But one of the important things with log4j is that the exploit at some point relies on LDAP being there. It doesn't have to rely on LDAP. There's other ways that the exploit can work through DNS and others. But one of the primary exploitation measures that we've seen, I know, is related to LDAP. And so it's possible that this is some sort of security research to identify LDAP servers out there that might be hosting a malicious payload. And most likely that's what it could be related to. the times don't align 100%, but that would be my best guess at kind of why all of a sudden there's this increase in concerted effort to do the scanning. The next thing I wanted to share, it wasn't from the top ports, but it was from the story we covered about the net USB printer vulnerability, and it referenced a very specific port, 20,005 TCP, and it kind of talked about this being a widespread port with lots of usage. And I just wanted to see, how does this present in our data? Do we see a lot of exploitation or scanning or reconnaissance activity for this port? And just looking at it in the last 150 days, which predates the at least the research that was posted by Sentinel Labs, you see there's actually a pretty consistent pattern of scanning, probably discovery scanning every 7 days. And then every once in a while, someone is interested and there's a lot more scanning on a particular day. But most of this is, somebody is definitely always on the lookout for this port and is looking at what's going on there. So I wanted to do something a little bit different. I wanted to look at the IP addresses engaged in scanning, and sometimes this helps us to understand if it's like more of a worm or more of just, again, discovery scanning or security researchers. And you can see the number of IP addresses engaged in scanning is very low. It's basically 2 to 10 usually, with some peaks here. And I wanted to see if this lines up at all with the disclosure timeline that Sentinel Labs had, and see if there's any kind of correlation. And the only pattern I found was really, there's in September when they were reporting the vulnerability to K codes, that there was a little bit of a peak there in how many people were doing concurrent scanning at the same time, basically. I don't think we can say that it's related or not necessarily. But I actually kept going back and back in time to see were there any other peaks. So going back to April, which is approximately when I think they might have been doing their research, just out of curiosity to see like how many IP addresses were we observing scanning on this port then. It was about 19, kind of all over. There's just 3 locations really. But more recently, I think in September, when that bigger spike was, it was about 74 IP addresses doing the scanning on this port. One thing that I found odd is that the hosting clusters engaged in this scanning activity, we normally associate actually with adversary rangers that are engaged in probing or scanning activity, looking for high-profile exploits. The only thing that doesn't necessarily line up is, just the dates. These are dates from September. And this vulnerability has just been disclosed. So it's probably unrelated, but I found it interesting nonetheless.
Yeah.
And finally, I just wanted to give our viewers an update on the MikroTik botnet scanning activity. So last year, a lot of our viewers might remember that we were paying attention closely to scanning activity on port 8291 TCP and on port 872A TCP. And this is about a year's worth of scanning activity in terms of the number of IP addresses doing scanning. We had done a lot of research on this. We presented it on ThreatTraq. And later, there were several high-profile DDoS attacks kind of attributed to this botnet of MikroTik devices. And you can see the scanning activity shortly thereafter actually subsided. So everything kind of went dark, I would say, in terms of scanning and exploitation activity on these ports. However, the devices that are vulnerable to this didn't really go away. And so we're always kind of monitoring and keeping an eye on it. And it's a little hard to see. You almost have to zoom in. But right at the end there and closer to current time period, probably for the last few months, definitely several weeks, we can see something reemerging again. It's not as heavy as it once used to be, not as loud, but certainly something is coming back. So zooming in on the last 30 days of activity and the number of IP addresses engaged in scanning, we see something interesting. Every few hours, maybe every 12 or so, there's about 400 to 500 IP addresses engaged in scanning activity, at least against port 8291 TCP. There's a well-known vulnerability there again. And I just wanted to explore that, understand it, and see, is a threat making a resurgence? Is something happening again? Go ahead.
If you go back to the last slide, it's interesting that this particular date, this smaller data, the majority of the ports seem to be on, like this slide, it's all on 8291, or a good chunk of it is, right? There's a lot of 8291, and the last one, it's disproportionate, right? On the current, the little honey, that is a lot more disproportionate. So it's an interesting.
Yes. So actually, I think both ports were targeted like last year heavily. So both port 8728 and port 8291 were heavily targeted, but it looks like now it's kind of just one of them is being targeted.
Yeah, so and none of the colors flipped here, but it's the 8291 is certainly the one that they're paying attention to.
Yes, and that was the one that was I hate to advertise it, but the easiest to exploit for this, unfortunately. And again, it seems like the problem probably didn't go away with these large-scale threats. It seems like they go dormant for a while, and then they make a resurgence. They try to come back, and sometimes if we don't catch them early and do something about it, they actually grow to these, I guess I would call it unregulated sizes. Or that's probably not the right word. But certainly, as I look at it, this could be security research. Just looking at this pattern, it could be security research, or it could be the beginning of a botnet reemerging. So I think what I wanted to do is just collect the IP addresses engaged in the scanning and see, is it hosting clusters? Is this ISP space? Who is doing the scanning? And unfortunately, it's not hosting clusters. Unfortunately, a lot of the scanning activity does seem to come back to devices worldwide that are residential in nature, I would say. So small office, home office type of devices out there that are doing this scanning. You can see they are worldwide. And I collected the last 8 days of scanning, data of who's doing this. And there were about 2,000 IP addresses. I looked them up with popular scanning services out there just to see what ports they have open. And a majority of these devices, I would say probably at least 50%, are related to themselves being MikroTik devices. Mm-hmm. So there are MikroTik devices scanning for MikroTik devices. And usually this is the beginning of a problem. It seems like, again, it's hard to say, is this Maris? Is this random bot, Glupteba? Is this something else? But whatever it is, it's definitely a threat that impacts these MikroTik devices, and it seems to be making a resurgence. And I think it's one that we're going to have to continue paying attention to. This chart reminds me that adversaries are always kind of paying attention to the news. They always know what's going on. There's a big DDoS attack, they go quiet, they go dormant. But later, they always come back because those devices are still out there and available for their exploitation. We'll keep an eye on this, and hopefully we can get ahead of this one and understand it before it turns into something much more sinister and much worse. So that's all I have for the internet weather this week. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll definitely keep updates on this threat and many others. And if you have any comments or feedback, or if you know about what's going on with the scanning activity on 8291 TCP, 8728 TCP, or even the LDAP ports, or any others, please give us your comments, feedback, and we'll try to investigate it and see if we can unlock further insights.